All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be getting into something that's becoming increasingly important in all of our lives, and that's artificial intelligence. But we're not just going to be talking about the latest and greatest AI tools. We're going to be taking a deep dive into how organizations can actually manage the risks that come along with AI.
Yeah, that's right. We've been taking a look at ISO IEC 23894.2023, which is kind of like the international standard for managing AI risks. It's a set of guidelines recognized globally to make sure that AI is being developed and used responsibly, minimize those potential downsides we hear so much about.
Right. And I think our goal today is to take this standard, which I'll be honest can be a little bit dense at times, and really break it down for you. We want you to come away with a solid understanding of the key ideas, the framework that it presents, and the real-world steps involved in managing AI risks. And you don't have to be, a super techie person to get it. We're going to make it clear for everyone. And one thing that's really interesting is that this standard points out that AI doesn't just bring, old risks in a new package. It actually introduces completely new and emergent risks. So that means we can't just rely on the same old strategies. We need a dedicated way of thinking about this.
You're absolutely right. The standard really emphasizes that from the start. It lays out some fundamental principles for managing these AI-specific risks. And while they do build on general risk management ideas, like what you'd find in ISO 31000, there are some really important differences when we're talking about AI.
Okay, so let's dive into these principles. First up is inclusivity. Now, obviously being inclusive is a good thing, but why is it absolutely essential when we're specifically talking about AI? What makes it non-negotiable in this context?
Well, the thing about AI is that it has the potential to have such a widespread impact. It touches so many different aspects of society. So if we don't have that inclusive approach to development and deployment, we're likely to miss out on some really crucial perspectives, right? Perspectives that could help us identify potential harms or unintended consequences. Different groups can experience the effects of an AI system in vastly different ways.
Right, so it's not just about being, politically correct or something. It's really about making sure that everyone's voice is heard. Can you give us an example of where a lack of inclusivity in the development process has led to, a negative impact, a real-world example?
Absolutely. Think about the data that's used to train a lot of AI systems, especially machine learning models. Now, just really quickly, for those who aren't familiar, a machine learning model is basically an AI system that learns from data to make predictions or decisions. So if the data that's used to train it doesn't reflect the diversity of the real world, let's say it overrepresents one demographic and underrepresents another, well, the AI system is likely to perpetuate and even amplify existing biases. That could lead to unfair or discriminatory outcomes for those underrepresented groups. Having diverse stakeholders involved from the very beginning can help catch these potential data biases early on.
That makes a lot of sense. So different people are going to see different potential problems in the data. What about beyond just the data itself? Where else does this principle of inclusivity really come into play with AI?
Well, transparency and explainability are huge. What makes an AI's decision explainable isn't going to be the same for everyone. A regulator might need a very technical explanation, while a business owner might need to understand the high-level logic, and then an end user, the person actually interacting with the system, might just want to know why a particular decision was made, but in very simple terms. So engaging with all of these different stakeholders is really important for defining what level of transparency is actually needed and how to achieve it for each specific audience.
Yeah, so it's about making sure the explanations actually make sense to the people who need to understand them. What about when AI is actually making decisions, like automated decisions?
Yeah, in those cases, inclusivity becomes super important for things like defining fairness criteria. What one group considers a fair outcome might be seen as biased by another group. So having diverse voices at the table when you're establishing those criteria is absolutely crucial for building AI systems that are truly equitable. And, going even further, those stakeholders can provide essential perspectives on where human oversight is necessary in those automated decision-making processes. And what that oversight should actually look like. How do we make sure humans are still in the loop when necessary?
So all of that really highlights how AI development can't just happen in a silo. You need those different perspectives. Now, another key principle is the dynamic nature of AI risk management. This isn't just a one-time checklist, is it?
Absolutely not. I mean, by its very nature, AI is a constantly evolving landscape. Many AI systems are designed to learn and adapt over time, right? As they interact with new data and new experiences, their behavior can change, and the risks associated with them can change as well.
So the risks themselves aren't fixed, they're moving targets as the AI learns.
Exactly. And it's not just the AI systems that are dynamic either. Customer expectations around AI are also shifting really rapidly as technology advances. People expect more and more from these systems. And then you have the legal and regulatory environment surrounding AI, which is constantly being updated as lawmakers try to keep up with the implications of this technology. So all of this together demands a risk management approach that is equally adaptable.
Okay, so how do organizations actually put this into practice? How do they stay ahead of these constantly shifting risks?
Well, the standard recommends that organizations establish specific structures and processes that are dedicated to identifying and tracking emerging risks and trends. This could involve things like actively monitoring new research, keeping up with technological breakthroughs, and staying informed about the latest legal and regulatory developments. It's basically like having an early warning system for potential AI risks.
So a dedicated intelligence unit for AI.
Yeah, kind of like that. And the standard also suggests that organizations should look at how AI risk management can be integrated with their existing management systems. Things like quality control, environmental safety, data security. By integrating AI risk considerations into those established frameworks, they can get a much more holistic view of the potential impacts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Leverage what you already have in place. So the next principle is using the best available information. And that sounds pretty straightforward, but I can imagine it's a real challenge when you're dealing with something as cutting edge as AI.
Right, and that's a really key point. The standard acknowledges that even though you always want to be using the best information available, there are going to be limitations, especially in a field that's moving as fast as AI. You might not have a lot of historical data, and predictions about future uses and impacts can be very uncertain.
So you can't always rely on a well-trodden path or a long history of data?
Exactly. So the standard advises organizations that are developing AI systems to actually track potential future applications even after the AI has been deployed. And similarly, organizations that are using AI systems should keep detailed records of how they're being used throughout their operational lifespan. This helps build that body of information, even if you didn't have a lot to work with initially.
Yeah, makes sense from a traceability and learning perspective. But what about situations where it's actually difficult to track how an AI is being used, maybe by customers or external parties?
Well, the standard recognizes those complexities too. Things like intellectual property concerns, contractual restrictions, or even just the way the market operates can make it challenging to have complete visibility into how AI systems are being used. So the important thing here is that those limitations themselves need to be factored into the risk management process. Organizations need to acknowledge what they can and can't track, and then adjust their risk assessment and mitigation strategies accordingly.
Okay, so understanding the gaps in your knowledge is just as crucial as what you actually know. Now, the standard also highlights the influence of human and cultural factors. This feels particularly relevant given all the discussions about how AI is interacting with society as a whole.
Absolutely. The way we behave as humans, our cultural norms, those things deeply shape how AI is developed, how it's adopted, and ultimately how it's experienced. So the standard emphasizes that organizations need to be paying very close attention to the broader societal landscape and understand how their AI systems might interact with existing patterns of behavior and belief.
And what kind of societal patterns are we talking about here, specifically in the context of AI?
Well, think about existing social and economic inequalities, for example. Organizations need to consider whether their AI systems could worsen those disparities, even unintentionally. Think about things like privacy and freedom of expression fundamental rights. How might an AI system impact those? It's about looking beyond just the technical capabilities and considering those ripple effects on things like equitable access to opportunities, personal autonomy, public safety, job markets, even the environment.
So it's about having a much wider lens and really thinking about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And finally, the principles wrap up with continual improvement in AI risk management. This reinforces the idea that this isn't a set it and forget it kind of thing.
So it's an ongoing process of refinement.
Exactly. It stresses the importance of actively looking for and identifying new risks that might emerge as AI is used in new and unexpected ways. They need to be constantly monitoring the wider AI ecosystem, looking at successes, failures, lessons learned by others in the field, and staying up to date with the latest research. So it's really a cycle of learning, adapting, and improving how you approach AI risk management.
Okay, so we've covered those foundational principles. Now, the standard moves into the framework for AI risk management. What's the purpose of having this kind of overarching structure?
The framework is all about providing a structure for integrating risk management thinking into all of the key activities within an organization that relate to AI. It's designed to ensure that this isn't just an isolated task, but it's woven into how they develop, deploy, and use AI.
And at the core of any good framework is leadership, right? The standard really emphasizes the role of leadership and commitment here.
Absolutely. The standard highlights that top management needs to be very clear in communicating their organization's policies, their overall stance on AI risks, and how they are being managed. And that communication needs to reach all stakeholders, both inside and outside the company. That visible commitment from leadership is essential for building trust and accountability around AI initiatives.
It's about setting the tone from the very top.
Exactly. They even suggest that organizations should consider making public statements outlining their commitment to responsible AI. That can go a long way in building confidence with customers, regulators, and the public. And then from a more practical standpoint, top management needs to recognize that this might require specialized knowledge and tools. So allocating the necessary resources is a key part of that commitment.
Right. It's not just saying the right things. It's about backing it up with resources and clear communication. The standard also briefly touches on the need for integration across the organization, which kind of echoes that inclusivity principle. But then it delves into the design phase of the framework, focusing specifically on understanding the organizational context. Why is that so critical when it comes to AI risk?
That's where organizations really need to zoom out and analyze the big picture. They need to look at the landscape where their AI systems will operate, both internally and externally. And we touched on the external context through the principles, but the standard lays out some really specific AI-related things to consider.
Okay, let's zoom in on those AI-specific factors. What are some of the key things organizations need to be mindful of when it comes to that external context?
Well, first off, they need to be really on top of any legal requirements that specifically address AI. This is a rapidly evolving legal landscape, so staying up to date with legislation and case law is crucial. And then there's a growing body of guidelines and recommendations on ethical AI use that are coming out from different sources. Government agencies, regulatory bodies, academics, industry groups. Organizations need to be aware of all those diverse perspectives.
So it's almost like a patchwork of regulations that they have to navigate.
Exactly. And it goes beyond broad AI ethics, too. Organizations need to be aware of any guidelines that apply specifically to their industry or domain. So, for example, if you're developing AI for financial services or healthcare, there are going to be some very specific regulations and ethical considerations you have to adhere to. And of course, you have to keep up with the rapid pace of technological advancement in AI. What's considered state of the art today might be outdated very quickly, and that can impact the risks associated with your systems.
And it's not just about the tech itself, right? It's about how society is reacting to and perceiving AI.
Absolutely. The standard emphasizes the importance of understanding the broader societal and political implications of deploying AI. This includes things like looking at insights from social sciences on how AI might impact communities and individuals. And I think a really crucial point is that they need to be very aware of stakeholder perceptions. Issues like a lack of transparency in how an AI works or any perception of bias in its outcomes can really erode public trust and damage an organization's reputation.
Right, so it's really important to keep a finger on the pulse of public opinion and any potential concerns.
Definitely. And it goes beyond just avoiding negative perceptions. They also need to understand stakeholder expectations. What do customers, partners, other interested parties expect from AI solutions? What do they expect in terms of functionality, reliability, how they are delivered? And the standard actually brings up a really interesting point. It says that organizations need to think carefully about how the use of AI, especially those systems that are constantly learning and adapting, might affect their ability to meet contractual obligations and guarantees. The scope and terms of contracts might need to be reevaluated because of the dynamic nature of AI.
That's a really insightful point. The fact that AI is always evolving could create some unexpected challenges for agreements that are more fixed.
Exactly, it can. And then the standard points to the contractual relationships involved in the design and production of the AI systems themselves. So this includes clearly defining things like ownership and usage rights for test and training data, especially when that data comes from third-party providers. And finally, there's the issue of complexity. AI can increase the complexity of interconnected systems and dependencies within an organization, so they need to really understand how their AI interacts with other technologies and the potential risks that come from that complexity.
Sounds like understanding the full context for AI risk is a lot more intricate and multi-layered than with more traditional technologies.
For sure.
Okay, so we've explored the principles, the framework, and the last piece of the puzzle is the risk management process for AI.
Right. This section outlines the step-by-step process for actually applying those principles and the framework to identify, assess, and manage risks in a very systematic way. It's like the classic risk management cycle, but tailored for AI.
So can you walk us through the key stages of this process?
Of course. It starts with communication and consultation, which is really about actively engaging with all the relevant stakeholders throughout the entire process. Then you have establishing the scope and context, which we touched on in the framework discussion, but here it's about defining the boundaries and objectives of the specific risk management activity you're doing. And then the next step is risk assessment, which is all about identifying those potential AI-related risks, analyzing how likely they are to occur, what their potential impact could be, and then evaluating the overall significance of those risks.
So classic risk assessment steps, but with that AI lens.
Exactly. After the assessment, you move into risk treatment, which is where organizations actually develop and implement specific actions and controls to mitigate or manage those risks. And then comes monitoring and review, which is absolutely crucial given how dynamic AI is. You need to constantly track those risks, monitor how effective your treatment plans are, and be on the lookout for new and emerging risks. And finally, there's recording and reporting, which is all about documenting the entire process, the findings, and the actions that were taken.
So it's a really comprehensive and ongoing process, always iterating and adapting to the ever-evolving risks associated with AI.
You got it.
Well, this has been a really, really insightful deep dive into ISO IEC 23894. And I think the main takeaway for everyone listening is that effectively managing the risks of AI is not just a theoretical exercise. It's not just checking a box. It really requires organizations to actively involve a diverse group of stakeholders, to deeply understand how AI systems work and how they evolve, to be constantly aware of the broader societal implications, and to build a risk management framework that prioritizes responsible development and use of AI.
I agree. We hope that by breaking this standard down, you now have a solid grasp of those fundamental principles and key considerations. It's a valuable starting point for thinking more critically about AI risk and how it can be managed proactively and effectively.
Absolutely. And as a final thought, we want to leave you with this. Given how rapidly AI is advancing and becoming more integrated into our lives, what role do you as an individual play in all of this? How can you contribute to the responsible management of these risks beyond what organizations and governments are doing? It's something to really think about as you encounter AI in your everyday life. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.